So you might think of square twists as, okay, there's a closed option, there's an open option. The closed option has a closed hole on the back. The open option has an open hole on the back. But I'm here to talk to you today about a whole number line of square twists that go bigger and also go smaller and connect to the back. So this is a way of thinking about these twists that's really helpful in designing. And I'm going to show you two different perspectives on how we can see how these twists connect together, and also stay till the end to see how to use this tool to design some pretty cool tessellations with only squares, no hybrids. We'll also be folding this really neat pattern I call Square Alchemy. No, I will not be folding it this small today, but this is our end result on a 32 fold grid. So we'll be using 32 divisions in our square grid today. This is what it looks like if you do it on 16 fold instead. So let's dive into the number line of square twists and see what we can learn today. So for starters, there's this twist in the middle that is different than the rest. We'll consider that a little bit later, but I want to start with how we get bigger and bigger. So these twists, the difference between them, so they're all squares, which means that they all have pleats running out in 4 directions, all running into each other perpendicularly. And the difference between these 3 twists is what shape is outlined in the middle. So in the closed case, we have all of these mountain folds of the twist coming in and outlining a single point. And so that single point is what you will see on the back side. So single point there outlined. The open square twist has these mountains coming in outlining 1 grid square. So that 1 grid square is what you see on the back. This one I call double open because its mountain folds are coming in and outlining 2 grid squares, or I should say a large square with 2 grid squares per side. And guess what you see on the back? Big open hole with 2 grid squares. Okay, so that's what this direction looks like and what you see on the back side. What I'm trying to convince you of today is that the front and the back sides are not just front and back, they're also different positions on the number line. So if we zoom out a bit, can bring in the rest of the line. And what we're looking at here is we've got closed square. This one I've done a video on before. I call it the cursed square. Sometimes I call it intermediating square if I'm trying to be scientific. And then the closed square on the back side. So this one, that square bit in the middle isn't actually twisting, it's just locking in place. And apparently I played with this and did something weird. This is not your standard cursed square, but we'll get to that in a moment. And so we can go more and more open back in the other direction, more and more open front to the right. So bringing this all together, I've got a diagram that I want to share with you, which is showing the centers of twists. So if we grab a small grid and we start by folding a closed square twist, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the center, and it's going to be a right-handed twist. I'm mostly doing this for demonstration purposes, but you can certainly follow along if you like. And squash. So I've got my closed square twist here. And the thing that I want to emphasize about this square twist is how the pleats run into it and where the center is. So when we're looking at this, I've got my mountain folds from the bottom and the left running in like so, my valley folds running in like so, and I'm going to squiggle these boxes to emphasize the similarity with this diagram. And what we've got here is a point at the intersection of the mountains. So this point here, that is the center of our twist. So if we wanted to go in a more open front direction, we would go half a spacing diagonally out this way. And now, if I want that to be my center, then I'm going to have one spacing of mountain fold all the way around this center. And what do you know? It's making an open square twist. If I were to move my center point even further out to the next grid intersection, keeping these same two pleats, now I'm going to have two grid squares of mountain around my center in all four directions. And notice I am keeping my two initial pleats. So this is the folding perspective of the number line of square twists, whereas before we were looking at more of the tile perspective. And I can keep moving the center point further and further out. If I go even further, then I'm going to get a triple open square. And each time I move my center, my two other pleats are shifting over one spacing each. So if I shift those pleats back in the other direction, so if we find our closed square again, and this is where my pleats are for that square, if we shift back in the other direction, and it was the shifting of pleats that led me to figure this stuff out. Then we're going to get our cursed square. Remember, we have to keep our pleats folded in the same orientation, so we keep the same valley. And this is why I call it a cursed square, because it really doesn't want to squash. But then if we shift our pleats one more spacing each, our pleats that are not fixed in place, all of a sudden, we end up with our valleys coming together at the same point, and that's going to make a closed square on the back side. And so we're able to shift our pleats to get from a closed square on the front to a closed square on the back. And it takes 2 shifts of pleats. That's really the key insight here, that we're shifting. We're holding 2 pleats fixed, shifting the other 2. So why are we holding 2 pleats fixed? Because that is what we're going to have in a pleat overlap in a tessellation as we're folding. So this is the folding perspective, and we can put twists that are either on the front or the back on that pleat overlap. We're just going to be changing where the center of the twist is, and also where the other 2 pleats interact with our pleat overlap. So there's a lot going on here. There's just one more kind of bonus idea that I want to throw out there, which is when we're looking at hybrid squares, and I'll bring us back to this view. When we're looking at hybrid squares, they're combinations of these different squares in the number line. So the hybrid square that, if you've folded a hybrid square, you've probably folded this one. It's hybrid between the closed and open squares on the same side. And the hybrids are always going to hybridize between twists on the same side, because if you don't, it leads to self-intersection of the paper. And if you can do that, please tell me how. And so we can also hybridize between any 2 twists on the same side. We can do closed open, we can do open double open, we can even do closed double open. Now, the important thing about these hybrid twists from a design perspective is how far apart the 2 twists that are being hybridized together are on the number line. Is it 1 jump? Is it 2 jumps? How many jumps you're making determines how the hybrid twist operates in a design. So that's enough theoretical knowledge for right now. Let's jump into practical folding. I've got my 32 fold square grid, so 32 divisions in each direction, and I'm going to start by folding a closed square twist exactly in the center. So first I need to figure out where the center is. I'll fold in half in one direction, and then in half in the other direction, and that will show me exactly where the center of my paper is. And I want to be careful to keep those mountain lines from the folding in half, and switch that one valley to a mountain so I can use those lines to fold the closed square twist. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice folding the double open square in alternation with the closed square, so you can get a good sense of the mechanics of that without adding too much complication at a time. So once I've got all of my pleats up for this closed square, I'm going to make sure that all of my valleys are actually on grid lines, and squash my twist. So when I squash, I'm pushing just outside of the corners for the closed square. And then the more open of a twist you have, the easier it is to just squash from the top. So I get my first twist in place, and now I need to put in my next twist. And if we look back at our reference piece, we can see that there are these tubes that are 2 spacings wide. And yes, this is tiny even for me. And so we can use that to reference where we're going to put our next twist to get our intersection of pleats where we'll put our double open square. So to get that tube, we need to have a new valley fold, 1 spacing out from the closed mountain. Those 2 spaces are between these 2 valley folds. So if we keep our pleat closed from the central twist, we're counting 1 out from that folded mountain. And then our mountain is always going to be 1 spacing away from our valley, parallel. And then we said we wanted to fold a double open square. So we've already got 1 mountain here. And notice I drew this mountain 2 grid spacings past the intersection with the other mountain. So if I was folding a closed square, my center would be at that intersection. If I was going for single open, it would be here, but my center is actually going to be over here, and we're going to outline this 2 by 2 block of grid squares with our mountains. And so we've got a mountain coming in on the top. We need a mountain coming out from the bottom, and that's going to go out to the right because the other one came in from the left. Also, we need to have this be rotational. We're not going to have the top and bottom or the left and right coming out on the same direction. So I'll bring up my tube pleat. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open the original pleat and run the vertical mountain up on the right-hand side of my outlined 2 by 2 square block. Running that up, then I'm going to set up my horizontal, and notice that I erased the extension of this pleat that was going through here. Then my horizontal comes out on the bottom of the block of grid squares. And once we've got that double open twist, we can go ahead and press it flat from the top and use the bone folder to squash it very firmly. Now I'm going to rotate around, and it's not going to matter particularly which direction I rotate, but I'm going to choose to go, so we have 2 options. We can go to the direction where the 2 pleats are really close together, or we can go in the direction where they're further apart. I'm going to go and pull that direction where they're further apart over to my right-hand side, just to make it a little bit easier for ourselves. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to spiral around the center when I'm adding twists. So my next one is going to be down here. Now we can use the same information that we used to place our first twist here to place these 2, because they're going to be top and bottom of the same pleat. We're also going to have a tube in this direction. And notice I'm referencing to this folded mountain, valley 1 spacing further out. And since I'm doing this twist at the bottom first, it's a neighbor of the double open, so it's going to be closed. And so I'm going to have this vertical pleat run up and cause a pleat overlap in there. And since it's closed, the mountain is going to come down on the same grid line as it came in from the top. It's going to go right on the same grid line it came in from on the left. Just the valleys are going to switch sides of those mountains relative to their pair on the opposite side of the twist. And so we'll bring this closed twist up like a pinwheel, set it up, and squash. All right, so time for our next twist. It's going to be a double open square. And if you folded alternating tessellations with square twists with open squares, you'll know that sitting at the top of the pleat overlap is that one open square, or that one grid square. Well, we're going to put that 2x2 block right in that same position, nestled up against those two mountain folds that we already have. So then when I open this, I'm opening and erasing the pleat that goes past this intersection of mountains and pushing it over two grid spacings so the mountain comes to the opposite side of the target square. And so with that vertical pleat in place, I can then come down to this horizontal pleat. And again, I erased the extension of the horizontal pleat that came in on the top. I need a pleat to come out on the bottom. And we can also use the fact that this is going to make a tube to reference this twist. So getting this new twist in place. What's really cool about this tessellation and why I call it Square Alchemy is that these corners of the twists are touching. And that leads to a really cool effect once it's done of a checkerboard pattern where you've got blocks that are these double open squares and then blocks that bound the closed square. So I think that's super cool. And yeah, that definitely made me more interested in this design. I first folded this as a just to get a photo to use in a path to mastery. So over on Instagram on Fridays, I post every week about a different tessellation. So here we're going to repeat the two steps that we did before: closed square, double open square. So these paths to mastery are showing what tessellations I recommend folding before you attempt the tessellation that I'm posting about. This week, this tessellation is in the path to mastery of the tessellation that I'll be talking about starting today. And I'll be showing you some of my recommendations for how to get from here to there at the end of the video. So we've got our closed square at the bottom of this tube pleat. And thankfully, this is a recorded video and you can go back and see how exactly I set that up on the previous time around, as many times as you want. And then here, another way to think about this is, yes, we do have this 2x2 block of grid squares that we're outlining, but also I know I need a tube pleat down below. And so the only pleat I need to find is the vertical going up, because that's the only one that isn't already determined by either an existing twist or a referenced tube. So I'm just making sure that that one is outlining the 2x2 space and not, for example, making a hybrid. And then I'm good to go. So then coming around to this last edge where we're adding now 3 twists, we've got the same closed and double open that we had before, but the difference here is that I can see when I have repeats, they're stepping out 2 spaces each time. So this pleat is going to be exactly the same as this pleat. It's just 2 spaces over. And so if I fold these 2 first, before folding the twist up here, I'm going to be running a pleat through this existing twist. And that's going to add extra creases to my final tessellation, and I don't really want to do that. So I'm going to tackle this tube where we're going to have our 2 twists closer together. Well, technically they're all equally spaced apart, but the pleats that we're going to be adding twists to are closer together. And that's going to not necessarily require, but I'm going to recommend a slightly different technique. So starting at the top, we're going to have our tube pleat, so our valley, 1 spacing away from the folded mountain, and our mountain next to that. And this is a pleat coming off of our double open square, so it's going to be a closed square. So the mountain running down is going to be on the same grid line as the mountain that came from the top. The valley will be opposite. But what I'm going to do, because this is going to make a real unfriendly overlap if I go ahead and flatten this twist, so I'm going to open this up to let me set up my double open square. So notice what I'm doing here. I popped this so that the mountain continues 2 grid spacings past where the horizontal mountain comes in. That lets me set up my new horizontal mountain at the bottom at the right distance, and I'm allowing that to pass my vertical from the top by 2 spaces before I add my vertical going to the bottom. So I'm setting up 2 twists at once now that we're more familiar with the double open square. And then I can squash the closed twist, finish setting up, making sure that all of my valleys are on grid lines for the double open, and squash that one as well. And then at my final pleat overlap, I need to open that up. So I'm pushing from the back here to get my closed square with my mountains all running horizontally and vertically on the same grid lines, and squash. All right, so that's 1 ring around. And then we want to continue moving around. I'm going to move to this set of parallel pleats next, bring them to my right-hand side. I can see in my demo piece, we've got this much already. And I'm going to get 1 more ring around the center before I would start getting partial twists at the edges. So we're going to be using exactly the same techniques to be adding these twists. It's just going to be more of them in a row. So I'll start with this pleat because it's the furthest out of the repeats. And one shorthand way to remember that is we always want to start with the shortest pleat of the set of parallel pleats. Whether we're putting square twists all on the same side or on opposite sides, we want to start with that shortest pleat. And it's coming from, well, first off, regardless of what twist it is, we need a tube pleat. and it's referenced to this mountain here. And then we want a double open square in here because it's coming off of a closed square pleat. So as I set up this tube, then I'm going to say, okay, my mountain vertically needs to jump over 2 spaces. My mountain horizontally needs to jump down 2 spaces. So the big difference between a normal square twist and a hybrid square twist is that the normal square twist will have the same jump between mountains on both the horizontal and vertical directions, and the hybrid twist will not. That's really the only difference. So then coming down, we've got a pleat crossing a tube pleat. And so we're going to start. So we have the first intersection closest to the twist we just put in, and then the second intersection. Hi, Daksh. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. And so I'm going to open this pleat intersection, pleat overlap. And since it's a closed twist that I'm putting in, the mountains are going to continue through straight on the same grid lines. And because this is a tube pleat that we're opening up, I'm going to also open up the bottom so I don't get that very unfriendly overlap, and set up my double open square on the bottom. So jumping over 2 grid spacings, which is enforced by the tube pleat spacing, and then the vertical coming down 2 grid spacings as well. And then I can set up, or rather finalize the setup of my closed square, making sure all of my valleys are actually on grid lines, squash the closed square, and then the open square, or rather the double open square. Now I've gotten through that set of parallel pleats, it's time to move on to the next direction. Now I've got 2 pairs of these tube pleats, and I'm going to be doing the exact same thing on each of them as I did with the previous tube. So the top of the tube will get a closed square. It's neighboring the double open. And the bottom of the tube will get the double open square, which is neighboring the closed square. I'll work on one tube at a time and squash the closed square first, and then the double open square, using my bone folder at the end to press both of them down very flat. Coming down to the next tube pleat, we already have a pleat overlap in here, so we don't need to reference the tube. We can just reference this pleat coming down through, closed at the top, double open at the bottom. I'm making sure that all of my valley folds are actually on grid lines before I squash. It's easy to think they're on grid lines. They were on grid lines when you last saw them, but things like to move around when they're hidden from view. And then coming around again, we see exactly the same thing. And this is expected because our center is in a position of 4-fold rotational symmetry. So we're going to see exactly the same thing on each side. And so the places where that does not hold is if we're putting a triangle in the center of a hexagon, for example, then that would be a position of threefold rotational symmetry when you had 6 sides, and so you would expect alternating patterns on adjacent sides. So again, this is the same exact move that we've seen already. And the benefit of this being a recording or recorded video is that you can go back and watch as many times as you like with whichever description of the process you prefer. The bottom line is that at each of these tube pleats, we're putting in 2 square twists, one of them closed and the other one double open. Rotating again, we see exactly the same thing and also another pleat on the bottom. So we'll go about it in exactly the same way. Setting up the closed square on top and the double open square on the bottom. And I've got a little bit of crumpling at the corner, so I poked it from the back with my bone folder to make sure that that angle is coming out right. And we come down to our next tube pleat. Setting up our closed and our double open square. We get first one and then the other. And now we have one more pleat overlap, which is coming from 2 double open squares. So it's going to need a closed square to match our alternation of twists. All right, so if I had more grid, then I would go about this around in exactly the same way again. I would start with that double open square on the single pleat and then close double open, and then on the next edge I would have a tube and I would have 3 repeats of that closed double open all the way around until I get back to the beginning and finish with another, it will be another closed square, because it's always another closed square that finishes a corner. So this is Square Alchemy, and the idea here is that you can put any size of square twist in alternation with any other size of square twist. This is part of what I was teaching in the alternating squares video. I'll make sure to put a link to all of these videos down below when I stop talking. And there's really unlimited numbers of these tessellations because we're not limited by a particular size of twist, but alternating twists all the time is going to get boring, and eventually you're going to be using more and more grid. So let's take a look at a different option that uses the number line of square twists. So the first one I'm going to show you, I actually have a video for. It's called Crenellation. It's in the square symmetry extension video. Again, I will put a link after I'm done talking. And the feature that we're looking at here is that we've got 3 positions of squares that are evenly spaced on our number line. So let's bring back the number line. In this case, our 3 positions of squares are going closed, open, and double open. So closed, open, and double open. And then if you're paying close attention, you'll also notice that there are other twists in between. And those other twists in between are all the same. In this case, they're all closed squares on the back. Now, the important part is just that they're all the same. Which twist it is doesn't actually make a difference. So go check out the extensions of square symmetries video to learn how to fold this one. And for more information about the exact positions and symmetries that we're looking at. The short version is that we've got 2 distinct positions of 4-fold rotational symmetry and a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. So we see 2 sides the same, 2 other sides the same, but not the same as each other. Whereas here we've got all 4 sides the same. This would be all 4 sides the same if we had more grid. And there's those 3 positions and then a twist that goes in between them all, that it actually doesn't matter which twist it is as long as it's a square and not a hybrid. So then this is actually the same structure, the same choices, just spaced closer together, so that double open square is actually sitting under these flaps of the single open square. So closed, open, double open, 1 step each on the number line of squares. We could go the other way instead. So the next 2 are using the number line in the opposite direction. And since I wanted to avoid, well, for 1, just doing the same thing on the opposite side of the paper, and for 2, using that cursed square twist, I decided to go 2 steps at a time. So I went closed front, 2 steps to closed back, 2 steps to double open back. These are evenly spaced on the number line, and we can see them in this tessellation by seeing, okay, closed front, closed back, double open back. And in this one, I used closed front square twists in that position that doesn't have the rotational symmetry. And then in this one, I used open squares with a denser spacing. So here we have star-crossed, this is rosebush, and these I called Crenellation, and I think this is wiggle room. And we're able to see, okay, we can use these extra squares, these bonus squares in the other positions as decorative elements. We can use them to make this kind of rose-like motif. We can use them to make this kind of cross-like motif. We can put whatever twist we want there. And the spacing between our central position of 4-fold rotational symmetry and our other twist in that more decorative position is what determines the spacing for the rest of the tessellation. So what we've got here is at the intersection of pleats of these 2 decorative squares, we put our square for the 2-fold position. So we've got our central 4-fold square, in this case, closed front. Then we've got our 2 decorative twists, in this case at 2 pleat spacing, and all that matters is that they're the same as each other. And at their intersection, we're going to put our second symmetric position, our two-fold position, which in the case of crenellation was one step more open front, and in the case of star-crossed is 2 steps more open back. And so then that's going to lead to our 4-fold position being the same number of steps, again, past that 2-fold position. So that's another way of arranging just square twists. And this is where the utility of the number line really comes in handy. And there's other ways of using twists in this symmetry, but they all involve hybrid squares, either a hybrid square in the 2-fold position, a hybrid square in that decorative position, or a hybrid square in both. So if you're interested in those, I think I did talk about them in the symmetry extension video. And I also talk a lot more about them and have crease patterns with them in advanced twist techniques. So this is my course that I try and update every year with new things that I've been figuring out. Things that actually are making their way into like mathematical papers and publications. Things that are giving more options for what to fold and ways of arranging twists. So at its core, advanced twist techniques is about, okay, what are the new twists that I discovered this year? What are the new ways of designing tessellations that I discovered this year? What are the new ways of thinking about tilings? That's where I introduced this idea of a number line of twists. So if you want to be on the forefront of origami tessellation theory, twist-based theory, then go ahead and join me for advanced twist techniques. There's already 2 years of content up there. I do like a deep dive once a year, and there's, I think, about 70 crease patterns that exemplify these different options. So it's about 3 books worth of content, and it's in video form. I'm showing you how to fold things, so you're not trying to decipher things from books. So go ahead and check that out. Again, I'll be dropping the link in the description. So I hope that you had fun folding these double open square twists with me, folding Square Alchemy. And I will see you not next week, because I'm going to be traveling, but the week after, to talk about the same idea, the number line, different sizes of twists on hexagons. So happy folding, and I will